The Marxists don't see themselves as being irrationalists. They see themselves as doing proper scientific work. They believe that their work is true. They also have a moral dimension because they think that their conclusions about society and their prescriptions are not just true, but also morally good.
So whoever's in control got the guiding narrative that everyone lives by.
Literally, our human nature is a product of the society and of the ensemble of social relations. You claim not to be a structuralist, nor do you believe in a totality. Why should we? What reason do we have to believe you? And Foucault's response is, there is no reason. And he laughs.
Hi there. Let's talk about Searle.
Yes, we will talk about Searle.
But we're not going to start there. We're going to talk about something else first, right?
That's right.
Okay.
The connection between Marxism and postmodernism.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, so first.
There's no connection there.
No. How could Marxism and postmodernism be connected? It's impossible. Yeah. Oh, the ridiculousness of it all. All right. So let's start here. So what's the best way to do that? Okay, so when a few years back, probably 2016, 2017, 2018, in that era, Jordan came to prominence, and in that, when all the hubbub was going around at the U of T and all this, he started using the phrase postmodern neo-Marxists. And this was, of course, very upsetting to the postmodern neo-Marxists because they don't like to get labeled. But there was an argument that was brought against this. And what people said was something like the following. They said, look, Marxism is a grand narrative. It's a large, overarching explanation of something like how society works and how various groups are being oppressed and exploited. Marxism also claims to be true. They claim to be correct. So the story goes, the Marxists believe they're correct. They, in fact, believe themselves to be something like scientific in their approach. They believe themselves to be doing something like a science of society or a science of the social world or a science of economics. It's a thing like that. The Marxists don't see themselves as being irrationalists or being irrational at all. They don't see themselves as being spiritualists. They don't see themselves as engaging in something like, I don't know, witchcraft or anything like that. They see themselves as doing proper scientific work. They believe that their work is true. They also have a moral dimension because they think that their conclusions about society and their prescriptions are not just true, but also morally good. Right? Yeah. So the Marxists, that's the Marxists. So the objection goes like this. Look, postmodernism, as it turns out, denies any kind of a meta-narrative at all. So that's a phrase that actually comes out of Jean-François Lyotard. And what Lyotard said was that there are no more, that postmodernism contained within it an incredulity toward meta-narratives. So postmodernism is, on that understanding, contains within it a skepticism about the possibility of meta-narratives at all. And what that means is that Marxism turns out to be a grand narrative, something like a grand narrative about humanity. And postmodernism contains the view that there are no grand narratives about humanity at all, that there can't be grand narratives about humanity. And so the idea here is that it's not possible for the postmodernists or the neo-Marxists to be in league in the way that Dr. Peterson has claimed, precisely because those two things are in contradiction. See that?
Yep,
okay.
I see
But
it.
There's a little bit else. If you read through the postmodernists, they appear very often to do things like deny the existence of objective truth. to deny the existence of objective standards of beauty, of good, of what is moral, what is right and wrong. Whereas Marxism absolutely has a vision for what is good and absolutely has a vision for what is moral, what is right and what is wrong. So for those reasons, people say, look, Marxism is a grand narrative which believes in objective truth. It thinks it's objectively true, and it thinks that its conclusions and its views are moral and good. Postmodernism denies meta-narratives. It's incredulous towards meta-narratives. It is very skeptical of objective truth. It's skeptical of any kind of objective standards, and it's skeptical of any kind of transcendent objective morality. And for that reason, postmodernism and Marxism are incompatible. Right. I'm going to say that objection doesn't cut the ice, because I don't think it really, it misses out on, it captures the outside fringy kind of outside figures of outside fringes of these ideologies, the stuff that kind of boils up to the popular consciousness, but the underlying impulses, view, I don't want to say structure, but the underlying set of motives and outlook, you might say, is broadly similar. Does that make sense?
I think it does make sense.
Okay.
Well, now that you've explained postmodernism to me in the previous podcast that we've had, nobody can live a life like that without some sort of meta-narrative. So it's not surprising to me that they clamped on to Marxism.
Yeah. So, yes, that's right. No, I mean, the idea that there is no grand narratives, that there are no objective truths, and that there is no objective morality, and that everything is socially constructed, that sounds like a meta-narrative. Right. It looks like the postmodernists are already having a view of the world.
Yeah.
And so their idea, well, there is no meta-narratives. Well, hold on. You could, it's almost all entirely self-referential. There is no objective truth. Is that statement true? There are no meta-narratives. Are you proposing a meta-narrative about society? Right. We can do this all day. So what I want to do, though, but an objection has been raised that these two things are incompatible based on features that appear to be part of these views. And so because the objection has been raised, the objections must be answered. So let's answer them. Okay. The first thing that I would like to do is point out that when we're talking about the social justice folks, the claim that they're not mixing postmodernism with neo-Marxism simply doesn't cut the ice. And I'd like to show you how. So first, this is the book Beautiful Trouble. Its subtitle is A Toolbox for Revolution. Okay. We find in here a theory on pedagogy of the oppressed. Okay. That's a book written by a neo-Marxist, Paulo Freire. Well, that's interesting. We also have in here, if I can just find it real quick. Oh, let's go right here. We have another neo-Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, in the section on cultural hegemony. And we're going to quote Gramsci today. But what's really interesting is that if we flip over just a few more pages, we also find intellectuals and power. And Michael Foucault was a French historian, social theorist, and philosopher whose writings about power have had a profound impact on the humanities and the social sciences. He's a very clear postmodernist. In fact, he might be the paradigmatic postmodernist. And yet we have both neo-Marxists and the postmodernists in the same activist toolkit.
Right.
So the idea that the social justice folks are not mixing postmodern insights and neo-Marxist insights just doesn't cut any ice with me. So before we go any further, what I want to do is, if I could, is kind of crack the objection a little bit. I want to read something that will make people skeptical of the whole idea that Marxism and so we're going to do that. And
okay,
here we go. You see, I want to nail this part down. The activists on the ground are very clearly using postmodernism and Marxism. Are we like, that's pretty clear. Can you see that when you watch them operate?
Well, because they stand so, because they have such devotion to the movement, you don't get that kind of devotion without some sort of belief.
Yes.
And that's a grand narrative right there.
That's right.
So so I do see it. Definitely, I see it.
And you can also see the postmodern elements when they're ripping apart language and dissolving and deconstructing, right?
Yes.
So we can see that there's these two elements here. So we're going to quote from Foucault. This is an interview that he gave. And it is in, it's called Prison Talk, an interview with Michael Foucault. And so people always say like the Marxism and postmodernism is not compatible, but let's read something here. The questioner asks this, says, the question is, you seem to have kept a certain distance from Marx and Marxism. This was said against you already about the archaeology of knowledge. The archaeology of knowledge was a book Foucault wrote. And here's Foucault's answer. But there is also, on my part, a sort of game about this. Well, who could have guessed, Foucault? Who could have picked out that? Perhaps a psychologist who's been reading this very carefully might be able to analyze what's going on and figure out that there's some gamesmanship going on. Someone who studies personality might have been able to figure that out. Okay, so that's the first thing. So he's going to continue. But there is also, on my part, a sort of game about this. I often quote concepts, texts, and phrases from Marx, but without feeling obliged to add the authenticating label consisting of a footnote and laudatory phrase to accompany the quotation. So right there, he's going to quote concepts, texts, and phrases. Yeah, he's quoting from Marx, but he's he's not going to add the footnote. And he's going to explain why now. Provided you do that, add the phrase and the accompany of a quotation and a footnote. Provided you do that, you are regarded as someone who knows and reveres Marx and will be suitably honored in so-called Marxist journals. So I'm just going to read this whole piece again. I'm going to read it from top to bottom, and it's just amazing how he says the quiet part out loud. The person asks, you seem to accept a certain distance from Marx and Marxism. And he says, but there's also a part, on my part, a sort of game here. I often quote concepts, texts, and phrases from Marx, but without feeling obliged to add the authenticating label consisting of a footnote and laudatory phrase to accompany that quotation, or accompany that quotation. Provided you do that, you're regarded as someone who knows and reveres Marx and will be suitably honored in so-called Marxist journals. But I quote Marx without saying I am, without quotation marks, and because people are unable to recognize Marxist texts, I'm considered to be someone who doesn't quote Marx. Does a physicist feel it necessary to quote Newton and Einstein when he writes a work of physics? He uses them, but he doesn't need the quotation marks, the footnote, and the eulogistic comment to prove how completely he is being faithful to the master's insight. And because other physicists know what Einstein did and what he discovered and proved, they can recognize him in what the physicist writes. It is impossible at the present time to write history without using a whole series of concepts directly or indirectly related to Marx's thought and situating oneself within a horizon of thought which has been defined and described by Marx. One might even wonder what difference there could ultimately be between being a historian and being a Marxist. Question. So you would call a Marxist historian a redundant expression, as Astruc said about American cinema? Michael Foucault. More or less, and the debate has its beginning within this general horizon of thought defined and coded by Marx. And those who call themselves Marxists because they play by rules which aren't Marxist but communistological, that is, defined by communist parties who decide how you must see Marx, and so as to be declared by them a Marxist. So there's a whole lot there, but we'll just do briefly the quotations there are I often quote concepts, texts, and phrases from Marx without feeling obliged to add the authenticating label consisting of a footnote and laudatory phrase to accompany the quotation. But I quote Marx without saying I am, without quotation marks, and because people are unable to recognize Marx's texts, I'm considered someone to be someone who doesn't quote Marx. And then the second part there, he says, it's impossible to write a history without using a whole series of concepts directly or indirectly related to Marx's thoughts and situating oneself within a horizon of thought which has been defined and described by Marx. So right there, Foucault, who is the paradigmatic postmodernist,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everyone says, well, they're not Marxists. They're not Marxists. Here he is saying, of course I'm quoting Marx. You just don't recognize it. So now with that in mind,
have to, because he's underneath everything as far as Foucault is concerned.
That's right. That's correct. Marx is all over the place. And so I'll just read you. This is from Deleuze and Foucault. This is a quote from Foucault. He says, in engaging with a struggle that concerns their own interest, whose objectives they clearly understand and whose methods only they can determine, they enter into a revolutionary process. Now listen to this. They naturally enter as allies of the proletariat because power is exercised in a way in order to maintain capitalist exploitation. They genuinely find themselves in the cause of the proletariat by fighting in those places where they find themselves oppressed. Women, prisoners, conscripted soldiers, hospital patients, and homosexuals have now begun a specific struggle against the particularized power, the constraints and controls that are exerted over them. Such struggles are actually involved in the revolutionary movement to the degree that they are radical, uncompromising, and nonconformist, and refused any attempt at arriving at a new position at the same power with best the change of masters. These movements are linked to the revelatory movement of the proletariat to the extent that they fight alongside the controls and constraints which serve the same system of power. I mean, Marx, there's nothing about that Marx would disagree with, I don't think.
No, I don't think so.
That's right in Marx's wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So Foucault is quoting Marx all over the place and using Marx. So very clearly, we're not dealing with a situation where at least the theorists themselves have thought these things to be incompatible.
Uh-huh.
So we might want to wonder what's going on. Is that all clear so far? Are we seeing how that all shows
clear.
up?
I see it. Yeah.
Okay. So with that in play, we need to have a little bit of a conversation of like, okay, how did Marxism and postmodernism get fused together? We have to ask ourselves what's happening here.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
And I think there's a couple of things. So here's what I think is going on. I think Marx's underlying philosophy and the underlying philosophy of the neo-Marxists, including people like Gramsci in the Frankfurt School, set up an understanding of knowledge, truth, and ontology. Ontology just means how things exist or are existing in the world. Sets up that system. And I think that the postmodernists are not nearly so relativistic and nihilistic as people say they are.
Right.
I don't think, I think they, to foreshadow, I think, as Foucault said, there's a bit of a game being played.
Yeah.
And you could see that if you were, I don't know, a well-trained psychologist would pick up on that. Okay. Might be able to see the games. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. So let's have a look at that. So postmodernism and anti-essentialism.
Okay.
We're going to just pull this out here. So I'm going to read a couple of things from Michelle Filippini, who wrote a book called Using Gramsci, A New Approach. And we're going to read a couple of quotes about how she's interpreting him.
Okay.
Or quotes that she pulls from him. And then we're going to show how that view is going to set ourselves up for the postmodernism. Remember, one of the doctrines of postmodernism, or there's a few, is that everything is constructed. It's all socially constructed or culturally constructed or linguistically constructed or historically constructed. It's not, there's nothing that's transcendent that holds anything together. It's just the elements of the social milieu that allow things to hold together in any kind of a meaningful way or in any kind of way at all. So all of our concepts, ideas, our thoughts, all of the discourse, it's all socially constructed. And then we impose that on the world. It's not that we're pulling our concepts and ideas from the world. We're not harvesting a bounty of concepts and ideas from the world. We're creating them and then trying to sort the world into them. We're reading the world through the language and concepts that have been created by people in power, and those concepts and ideas set the tone for the conversation and direct the conversation and direct the discourse in a way that benefits the people who created the language, who have power, and the interests of the people who have created the language and conceptual schemes, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
That's something like that. So, we're going to read a few things from Gramsci, which are going to set the table for that. So, man is to be conceived as an historical block of purely individual and subjective elements, and of mass and objective or material elements with which the individual is in an active relationship. To transform the external world, the general systems of relations, is to potentiate oneself and to develop oneself. So there's the quote. And then the image here is clear, says Filippini. Each individual is an aggregation of individual elements and mass elements, both subjective and objective, of personal characteristics and relational characteristics. That each individual is not only defined solely on the basis of his own subjective characteristics, but owes his genesis to the complex interrelationship between specific subjective factors on the one hand and general social relations on the other. Okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Circular.
Right. So
nothing coming from the outside.
Right. It's all well, the outside, such as it is just society itself.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing transcendent there. Okay?
Yeah.
So here's the second quote. Human nature, on the contrary, may only be defined with the ensemble of social relations. It is not a fixed concept, but a developing one, not of unity, but of inherent contradictions. So I'm still quoting Filippini here. The image of man portrayed by Gramsci is thus unrelated to either his physical or mental constitution or to his singularity, his self-referential being. This dual negation, however, reveals two positive characteristics of human beings: the historicity, or political quality, defining the contingency of each and every individual formation. And this presupposes that the transformation of the world in order for people to fully express their individuality, and the sociality that sees social relations as a constituent element of an individual's being. So, there is no fixed concept of human nature. It is, as he says, it's a historical and contingent thing entirely. There isn't anything transcendent. Okay?
Yeah.
So here's that. I'm going to quote at the end. So finally, by referring to the civil society as the quote state, Gramsci aims to relativize and historicize the unity of social life, thus opening the way to challenging of an order that is only such if perceived from a viewpoint of a particular social group. Society, as we have seen with human nature, does not contain any inherent, eternal, transcendent principle. Its unfolding depends on the constant recomposition of its unity by the dominant ruling classes. It's right there. There is no fixed, transcendent human nature.
No. So whoever's in control is got the guiding narrative that everyone lives by, and when that would change, then the next dominant voice would be in control, but there's nothing outside of that. It's just
that's right.
It's just limited to man.
Yep. And so how human nature, our composition as social beings, our self, literally our human nature, is a product of the society and of the ensemble of social relations, and that is a product of the hegemonic values and culture and ideas of the ruling class. He's knocking on the door of postmodernism right there. Because human nature, Filippini even says it's not a beautiful quote, but it's a perfect quote for explaining what we're trying to do. Because she says, as society, as we have seen with human nature, so she's including human nature with society, does not contain any inherent transcendent principle. That's it. Transcendence is gone. There's no imago Dei of the Christians, right? The imago Dei, the image of God. There isn't that. There's no eternal soul. There's nothing absolute or objective. It's entirely a product of social relations. So it's entirely socially constructed. That's what the postmoderns think.
Yeah.
I mean, he's knocking right on the door.
So when you get up in the morning, there's no one with you. There's no one with you until you are conversing with other people. And learning from other people. There's nothing else beyond that.
That's
You're
right.
alone.
There isn't.
You're alone. Yeah.
You're not only are you alone, but there's nothing that holds you in place except for that ensemble of social relations. There's no inherent properties to you at all.
Right.
So it's not even that I'm by myself. It's actually almost worse than that, because myself only exists as a social object. So there is no transcendent self for me to be with.
Right. So then if you are someone who's wanting to contemplate your individuality, you can't do that because right. So it's pushing people towards that understanding of always having to refer to themselves in terms of their relationship with other people.
Yeah. Their social grouping, right?
Yeah. Their
That's
social grouping. Yeah.
Well,
right.
And where do we see that popping up? That's the standpoint epistemology of the postmoderns.
Yeah.
Where you have knowledge based upon, are you black, are you white, are you gay, are you straight? Like that's the intersectionality that shows up. That process saying we're purely social beings defined entirely by our social group. That's the impulse that allows them to get a standpoint epistemology off the ground. Right? That's their intersectional standpoint epistemology. And boy, that winds up being a huge problem later on down the road. You can see what's going on here, right? It's just blindingly obvious what's happening. That that Gramsci has walked us right down to a view of human nature that is utterly anti-essentialist, and that is right in line. That is right in line with the postmodern view.
Explain what essentialist means.
Anti-essentialism is the view that there are no substances, no essences, no soul, no spirit. There is no essence of any object. So there's no transcendent thing which is unchanging and which makes an object what it is.
Right.
A thing is what it is entirely contingent way. So everything is infinitely malleable. There's no essence. For example, there's no transcendent principle which defines me as a fixed human being. There's no transcendent principles which define human nature. None. Because that would require there'd be an essence which everything else about me, all of the other stuff, my height, my weight, all of those things are kind of contingent accidents of how tall I happen to be or what I ate last night or whatever else. But there would be some on a say a traditional view, some transcendent things about me which make me what I am, regardless of my social situation or otherwise.
Right.
And the Marxists and the Gramsci and the postmodernists deny that. They say, no, you're completely a product of your ensemble of social relations, and your historical context. There's nothing transcendent. There are no essences, no souls, no spirits, no substances. There's nothing which makes the unity of an object what it is. Objects can be described from an infinite number of potential points of view and can be altered in an infinite number of ways. That's true of everything. So nothing has there are no sharp dividing lines. There's nothing that you can appeal to. There's no objective standards. There's no absolute standards. There's no universals. There's nothing like that.
When a baby is born, there's nothing about the baby that is there then before it is part of the world. Right.
It's almost worse than a blank slate. Because you might say, well, it's a blank slate. They would say, well, the blank slate is socially constructed too. We're creating a blank slate. It's not, it's hollow.
Right.
It is a lump of mass that can be viewed from any number of things, and it only even becomes a baby because we've called it that.
Right.
Baby is a category that we've created for ourselves. We could get rid of that category altogether if we wanted to, and then it wouldn't be a baby.
Like we do now with girls and boys. Those are categories as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So now, actually, this might be a good spot to read the Pareto, which I will do now, because this is actually Foucault's concern is with the ordered objects that constitute our social reality. What genealogical analysis does at the most basic level is reveal net additions to dumb reality, as when an essential human sexual nature is supposedly unearthed by the very disciplinary activity and pronouncements that construct that nature. The point is not to reduce dumb reality to so many constructs. It is to expose how many constructs have been and continue to be deployed as constituents of that reality. That's G.C. Prato from the chapter Truth and Relativism on his book on Searle and Foucault. And you see how he's doing that, right? Foucault is saying all these things that we think are the nature of humans or the nature of this, those are actually constructed by our thinking about them. They're not actually in the world.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So I mean, you can see how Gramsci's view dovetails perfectly with Foucault's view. Right? Gramsci
yes, it's
saying,
very empty. It's empty, just like Foucault's is empty.
But conceptually, they work together beautifully.
Yep, they do.
But hold on. I was told that postmodernism and Marxism are these unrelated things that couldn't possibly have anything to do with each other. Whoops. Oops. Okay, let's keep going because it's, as it always is with postmodernism and neo-Marxism, don't worry, it's about to get worse. So what we're seeing is that the neo-Marxists, particularly Gramsci, are already moving toward the ontology, the view of how things exist in the world, or how the world is constituted. Ontology is just a word that means existence for the people watching who don't know. So are already moving toward the idea about how things exist. Marxists are moving toward the ontology of the postmodernists and toward the epistemology of the postmodernists. Okay? So you're going to get...
And the epistemology is...
That is way of knowing.
The way of knowing. So ontology is what is.
Yep.
And epistemology is understanding what is.
Is knowing. Yeah.
Knowing.
So ontology is what is, and then epistemology is how we know things.
Yeah.
So
yep.
Okay. The views, once you understand human beings as being an ensemble of social relations, and you understand everything as being historicized, your epistemology is going to reflect that, and so is your ontology.
Right.
That worldview is going to leak into everything. So because Gramsci thinks that you're just a product of your social relations, of the ensemble of social relations, that's going to influence your viewpoint and how you think about the world, and thus your epistemology, how you know things.
Yeah.
It's also going to influence your view of what can exist. For example, he thinks there's no transcendent principles of human nature. So Gramsci is going to walk us right to the door of postmodernism. Okay. So that's going to get us in the conceptual ballpark. But there is this other objection which shows up, and that is the idea that there is this cryptonormativity.
Cryptonormativity.
So this is an idea that I got. Actually, you might know the guy who I found this from. If I can find it real quick. Jordan was at the University of Toronto, right?
Yep.
Okay, there was a philosopher at the University of Toronto named Joseph Heath, who's just absolutely brilliant. And Jordan might be familiar with Heath.
He might. I haven't heard of him though.
Let's see if it's yeah, he wrote a blog post years ago. So I'm going to quote Heath, and then I'm going to quote Habermas. So here's the idea. The idea is that the postmodernists kind of gesture toward and allude to and kind of posture as we're value free. We don't have any moral concerns. We're outside of that milieu. We're just criticizing everyone from every single possible perspective, right? We don't accept anything like a what would you call it? Anything like a meta narrative. We don't accept anything that would be like an overarching transcendent morality. We don't accept any of that. Like, that's ridiculous. So say the postmodernists about themselves. Now, we're going to crack that too now.
Okay.
So here's what Heath says, and I think this is bang on. A long time ago, Habermas wrote a critical essay of Foucault in which he accused him of crypto-normativism. The accusation was that although Foucault's work was clearly animated by a set of moral concerns, he refused to state clearly what his moral commitments were, and instead just used normatively loaded vocabulary like power or regime as rhetorical devices to induce the reader to share his normative assessments while officially denying that he was doing any such thing. The problem, in other words, is that Foucault was smuggling in his values while pretending he didn't have any. So now I'm going to read, Habermas is going to say this for himself. He says, "It remains finally to examine whether Foucault succeeds in escaping the crypto-normativism of which the human sciences that preen themselves for their value freeness are guilty of in his own view. Genealogical historiography," which is Foucault's method, or one of his methods, "is supposed to reach behind discourse totalities, within which alone disputes over norms and values can occur, with a strictly descriptive attitude. It brackets normative validity claims as well as claims to propositional truth, and abstains from the question of whether some discourse and power formations could be more legitimate than others. Foucault resists the demand to take sides. He scoffs at the Gauchist dogma which contends that power is what is evil, ugly, sterile, and dead, and that upon which the power is exercised is right, good, and rich. For him, there is no, quote, right side. Behind this is the conviction that the politics that has stood under the sign of revolution since 1789 has come to an end, and that the theories that have brought out the relationship between theory and practice are passé." Okay?
Okay, that was a lot. So
yeah, so
that was a lot.
So yeah, that was. But the key takeaway from that little phrase is, if we can find it, genealogical historiography, so Foucault's method, is supposed to reach behind the discourse with a strictly descriptive attitude. It brackets normative validity claims as well as claims to propositional truth, and abstains from the question of whether some discourse and power formations could be more legitimate than others. So Foucault's official position is that he's being purely descriptive of how the power relations work and what's going on. And he is officially staying out of the question of whether or not he's picking sides. Right. Okay.
Right.
Well, now this grounding of a second order value freeness is already by no means value free, says Habermas. Now here's the hammer coming. Foucault understands himself as a dissident who offers resistance to modern thought and humanistically disguised disciplinary power. Engagement marks his learned essays right down to the style and choice of words. The critical tenor dominates the theory no less than the self-definition of the entire work. Foucault thereby distinguishes himself on the one hand from the engaged positivism of a Max Weber, who wanted to separate decisionalistically chosen and openly declared value bases from an analysis carried out in a value-free way. Foucault's criticism is based more on the postmodern rhetoric of his presentation than the postmodern assumptions of his theory. Okay? So here's the thing. If Foucault is just describing power and saying, well, we can push back against power with other power, he's got a problem. Okay?
Well, if I have power and someone else has power, there's going to be conflict. If that's all we're after is power. That's one thing anyway. Okay.
That's correct. So Habermas says it's not Foucault's intention to continue with the counter discourse which modernity has carried on with itself from his beginnings. He's not trying to refine language game with its basic concepts of autonomy, heteronomy, morality, etc., and turn it against the pathologies. He wants to undermine modernity in its language games. His resistance is not to be justified as a mirror image of the current power. If that were all, responds Foucault, to a corresponding question from Bernard Henry Levy, there wouldn't be any resistance, because resistance has to be like power, just as invented, just as mobile, just as productive as it is. It has to be organized and stabilized just as it is. Like it has to come from below and be strategically shared. So, but here's the question. But if it's just a matter of mobilizing and counterpower, of strategic battles and wily confrontations, why should we muster any resistance at all against this all-pervasive power circulating in the bloodstream of modern society, instead of just adapting to ourselves to it? Then the genealogy of knowledge as a weapon would be superfluous as well. It makes sense that a value-free analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the opponent is of use to one who wants to take up the fight, but why fight at all?
Why fight at all?
Why is struggle preferable to submission? Why ought domination to be resisted? Only with the introduction of normative notions of some kind could Foucault begin to answer this question.
There has to be an individuality to oppose it.
Yes, and there has to be a normative dimension. You have to have values. Foucault's claiming to be purely descriptive, but the only way that he could even suggest a reason to resist power, or even want to provide a guidebook for resisting power or a strategy for doing it, and Foucault clearly sees himself as a dissident, is if he has normative reasons for wanting to resist power.
Right.
Like Heath says, Foucault is smuggling in the normative ideas and the moral values using loaded language rather than arguing for them. Foucault is posturing as value-free, but actually his all of his work is deeply normative. So much for the nihilistic, relativistic nature of postmodernism.
Right.
Postmodernism's official doctrines lead to nihilism and relativism. It's a good thing that the postmoderns have been hiding their values and their goals so that they never get touched by the acid of their theories. See how that works? Yeah.
I do see how that works. So to me, this seems like, so he's trying to say that there's no value, that everything is in the conversation, everything, there's nothing outside the conversation. But if this is going to be a power, if you're going to be against a power, the powers that be, if you're going to be against the powers that be and fight against them, where can you sit? You can't sit within it.
Right.
You must be outside it somehow. How can you be outside it somehow if there's nothing outside? Yeah, right. I get it.
Or he says, so instead of, if we can't get outside, we have to come from above and below and from every possible angle to resist it.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Why resist it? Because you have normative values which you're hiding from all of us.
Yeah. So you want to, if you're resisting, then you're not inside what there is, because that's all there is. So how can you resist it?
Right. This is exactly the Habermas's point. Foucault, if what you're saying is actually true and your descriptions are accurate and it's just power versus power versus power versus power, then we're all in the power game eternally, and that's it. No one's outside it. You can't resist it. You're all just in it.
Yeah.
The only thing that Foucault's one thing is to say some power is more legitimate than other power.
Oh, I see.
He has to say that.
Would he say that? Did he say that?
Well, he officially says it's not. But then he gives us a path to resisting power. And he uses, as Heath says, and this is a beautiful phrase. I absolutely love the way Heath puts this. He says, the accusation is that Foucault's work was clearly animated by a set of moral concerns. Foucault refused to state clearly what his moral commitments were, and instead just used normatively loaded vocabulary as rhetorical devices to induce the reader to share his normative assessments while officially denying he was doing any such thing. The problem, in other words, is that Foucault was smuggling in his values while pretending he didn't have any.
Right.
That's what's going on.
Impossible.
Yeah.
Because it's impossible.
Yeah, it's because it's completely inconsistent. He's cutting off the branch on which he sits. So now he's not the only one to do this. Barbara Applebaum talks about this. Can I say this? So Applebaum is talking about Judith Butler. And Judith Butler was a a postmodern thinker and philosopher who worked in gender. Okay, one of the founding theorists of queer theory, which is where all this gender stuff comes from. So I'm going to quote from Applebaum's book, Being Good, Being White.
Was she a feminist?
Oh, yeah. She would say, I would even say beyond a feminist. If you could take feminism and go even beyond feminism, she'd be beyond it. She'd be right at the outside fringe of postmodernity.
Right.
She's on the fringe of the fringe of the fringe, the cutting edge of postmodern discourse, of deconstruction, of all of that. She's right there. And so she's going to say this, and this is stunning. She goes, another critique of Butler's involves Butler's rejection of normative foundations. From these critiques, a seeming inconsistency arises in Butler's work. On the one hand, Butler rejects identity categories as a basis for political action. On the other, she concedes identity categories are indispensable for political action. Moreover, while Butler rejects intentions, she also uses intentional terms in her writing. Ralph Sandland refers to this as Butler's quote-unquote double moves. By looking carefully at these double moves, as well as her attempts to re-articulate an innovative notion of agency, we can discern the critical and ethical concerns that are a consistent mark of all her theorizing. Butler's moving. Remember how Foucault was, he said there was a bit of a game that he was playing with Marx? Well, Butler's now using double moves to have a non-normative system, but actually within her, you can, by reading her theorizing, you can find deep ethical normative concerns. Wow. Too bad we couldn't have a psychologist.
What were her normative concerns?
Well, she's again, the power games, the oppression. She wants to have a struggle against the oppressive, patriarchal, heteronormative, cisgendered, yada, 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 all the way. Those are her normative concerns. But her official theory is that there are no normative foundations at all. So as Applebaum points out, these are double moves being made by Butler. A psychologist might have been able to read that and figure that out. If we had
one or two. If we had
a couple of those guys around, someone who's worked in personality would be able to pick up on this. Butler's ethical concerns will come into sharper focus through a close examination of the reasons she is so eager to reject any trace of a discursive core. Butler's concerns will be underscored through an alternate reading of her work. Liddell McWhorter, who defends Foucault against similar charges of inconsistency, influences my argument here. McWhorter contends that Foucault's analytics of power only appear inconsistent when one reads them as a model about power. In her reading of Foucault, McWhorter interprets his claims about power as a tool or a strategic move that Foucault must make in order to do his genealogy of the subject. A move, quote, designed to undermine some of the obstacles we face when we attempt to think in the absence of transcendental structures. So Foucault is engaging in a game, she says. He's doing an analysis of power in order to theorize in a way that allows us to get rid of any idea of anything transcendent. I take another cue from the work of Edwina Borsova-Carter, who highlights Butler's ethical concerns. I submit that reading Butler's insights about subject formation as a strategic tool, rather than about the theory of the subject formation, not only refutes the charge of inconsistency, but also corroborates her ethical and critical concerns. Butler is consistently interested in opening up possibilities that are closed off by our common ways of thinking. In other words, this gets you the deep ethical concerns, and all the deep ethical concerns is the cryptonormativity. That's it. That's just there. She's saying, well, this is all strategic. These moves are just strategic in order to get us to a particular place, and there's no inconsistency when you do that. And my answer is, yeah, we know. You're adopting these ideas strategically. You're not doing it honestly. You're doing it as a strategy. And while you hide your normative concerns, you bury the normative concerns while claiming not to have any. We're aware of this. There's actually a quote. Oh, man, this is... Kelly Oliver says, I propose that in order to be revolutionary, feminist theory cannot claim to describe what exists or natural facts. Rather, feminist theories should be political tools, strategies for overcoming oppression in specific concrete situations. The goal, then, of feminist theory should be to develop strategic theories, not true theories, not false theories, but strategic theories. We know.
Yes.
Postmodernist theories are under the crypto-normative thinking, the normativity of the neo-Marxists, that leftist normativity, that leftist morality is smuggled in by the postmodernists. They are not, in fact, value-free or just nihilistically deconstructing everything. They've built a series of theories which can be used to deconstruct absolutely anything as a strategic tool.
It's strategy, yeah. Not truth, not falsehood, but strategy.
That's right. That's exactly what they're on about.
Strategy to an end. Because if you're going to have strategy, you have to have a goal that you're going towards. And what's the goal?
Oh, well, we're going to get to that goal because Mark Leela is going to outline it for us in just a second.
Okay.
I just want to pull up. I might have read this to you before. I don't know that I did or not. If you want to have critical, like, because Alison Bailey is, okay. So she's going to go right here. Critical pedagogy begins from a different set of assumptions rooted in the neo-Marxian literature on critical theory commonly exuded with the Frankfurt School. Okay? Well, so she says, look, philosophers of education has made a distinction between critical thinking and critical pedagogy, right? Mm-hmm. The critical thinking tradition is concerned with epistemic adequacy. To be critical is to show good judgment in reasoning when arguments are faulty, assertions lack evidence, truth claims appeal to unreliable sources, or concepts are sloppily crafted and applied. In this tradition, sloppy claims can be identified and fixed by learning to apply the tools of formal and informal logic correctly. Critical pedagogy begins from a different set of assumptions rooted in the neo-Marxian literature on critical theory commonly associated with the Frankfurt School. Here, the critical learner is someone empowered and motivated to seek justice and emancipation. Remember those two words. Critical pedagogy regards the claims that students make in response to social justice issues not as propositions to be assessed for their truth value, but as expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social equality. Right? That's Foucault. You see that Alison Bailey quote? It's right there, right? You can see the elements of all the things that you can see Foucault's analysis of power there. Everything is about power. Your responses to social justice are really just expressions of power, right? And she says, and it's rooted in the critical theory of the Marxist tradition. So those concepts are coming together. Okay, what's happened is that the postmodern view, Foucault's view, his radical view, the Derridean view of language that we went through, all of that has basically taken. See, the Marxists were historicists. They think everything was historically constructed, right? Mm-hmm. But history did occur. And so everything is infinitely malleable, they thought, right? That gets us right to the door. There's no transcendental principles. But you still kind of have to contend with that history moves slowly. And you still have to contend with events occurring. And you can't just rearrange everything immediately.
Right.
What postmodernism does, it says, well, it brings in linguistic, cultural construction, social construction, all of those things. All of a sudden, now you've got something super potent. You've got a theory now that says, hey, not only are there no essences or substances or anything like that, and there's no inherent transcendent principles at all, but now we have a tool for ripping apart all of the concepts. Mm-hmm. So we can destroy all of the conceptual machinery and the conceptual apparatuses that we've used to build our society. Well, why would they want to do that? Well, they want to tear apart society. Why? Because they want to replace it with something else. Because they have a normative vision, which they've been denying. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what this shows is that the Marxists were already anti-essentialists who denied any transcendent principles, and that the pomos were never really amoral. Once you see that, the apparent contradictions become less of a contradiction and more like a gap between ideologies already oriented toward the same politics. So here's the knockout blow, and it's a beautiful phrase from Mark Leela from the New York Review of Books. He says this: I want to get a definition for our viewers here, because he's going to use a term that's a little bit obscure. The word syncretic means characterized or brought about by a combination of different forms of belief or practice. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So academic postmodernism is nothing if not syncretic, which makes it difficult to understand or even describe. It borrows notions freely from the translated works of Derrida, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, Julia Kristeva, and, as if that were not enough, it also sees in from all traditions from the French school. Given the impossibility of imposing any logical order on ideas as dissimilar as these, postmodernism is long on attitude and short on argument. What appears to hold it together is the conviction that promoting these very different thinkers somehow contributes to a shared emancipatory political end, which remains conveniently ill-defined. There you go. That's your answer. It's that all of these thinkers are being pulled of for the same politics. The organizing principle for all of it is the political principle. And so what they're doing is, as Kelly Oliver said, we want strategic theories. They pull the theories from various thinkers, which can be used for their political agenda. So what the social justice movement is doing is, we'll take some Marxism here and some neo-Marxism there, and we'll mix in a little bit of postmodernism, throw in some Foucault, add some Derrida, chop up some yummy Gramsci, make a great big stew of ideology, and delicious postmodernism.
Yeah.
Delicious social justice.
It's no deeper than politics.
That's right. Politics is the central animating concern, and the theories are all deployed and used or not in service of that theory or that of that politics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's what's holding it together. And so the result is that what happens is that the dialectical critique is just making slight alterations to the concepts in both camps until they can be fused. Once that happens, we get the wokeism, the fusion of postmodernism with neo-Marxist critical theory. Now, you can see how that shows up. The moral impulses and political program and political goals that left this kind of impulse of the neo-Marxists is the same as the postmodernists. The neo-Marxists are contributing a moral vision.
Mm-hmm.
They're contributing, and they contribute a lot of theorizing of, as Foucault said, all the concepts of the historian are coming from Marx, that horizon of thought. Mm-hmm. And then the postmodernists are introducing a second set of tools, which can be used in the surface of where the neo-Marxists were already going. So both of those groups are united by a shared politics, a shared emancipatory, if you want to call it, or liberationist agenda, as understood, as those terms would be understood by radical leftists, mm-hmm. which is why both of those thinkers, all of their thinkers, wind up, well, not all of them, but thinkers from both camps wind up in books like this, because mm-hmm. they're pulling from both sides of it. That is what is going on.
Whatever is convenient that they bring out.
Yes. They graft the theories and they grab onto the theories which they believe will allow them to achieve their political ends. Yeah. So the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists are not incompatible. The Marxists completely agree with the lack of transcendental principles, or at least the neo-Marxists like Gramsci agree that everything is malleable and that there's no transcendental human nature, no transcendental principles or inherent principles in society or human nature.
Well, there can't be, otherwise their theories won't work.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
That would mess everything up. Yeah.
That's correct. So, and Searle points that out in his essay on the Western rationalistic tradition. He says exactly that. He says, I don't have that quote right here, but I have a different quote from him, which I'm going to pull out. He says, let's see it. I don't have it here. I'd have to go find it. But what Searle says in his essay on the Western rationalistic tradition is that the draw of these theories, people didn't come to their critique of the Western rationalistic tradition on a set of academic theories. What they did is they went searching for an academic theory that was already in line with what their politics allowed them to do.
Mm.
They didn't come to the critique of the Western rationalistic tradition because they didn't come by it honestly. They had a political theory and a political agenda that they wanted to implement, and these theories are convenient and useful for helping them do that.
Yeah.
It's stunning, but he's right. It's, how do I say this? It's almost maddening to a degree, because you sit there and you realize that what has been dressed up as what's been dressed up as a series of academic theories about how the world really is actually a set of constructs that were made for the sole purpose of allowing them to attain their political goals.
Yes,
that makes sense?
To take down everything that has been built for the betterment of our societies and our well-being.
That's right. I'm going to pull this quote up here because it's too good. Let's see.
And I imagine it gives people who have been unable to attain any amount of satisfaction in their lives for, if you were unable to find a mate, if you're unable to find a career, if you're unable to build a relationship and a home, then you can blame it on someone.
Yeah. So here it is. Searle wrote this, I believe this was written in 1994. He's talking about if the relation between the Western rationalistic tradition to the traditional ideas of the university is more or less obvious, the relation between attacks on the Western rationalistic tradition and proposals for educational reform is less obvious. And he says, underlying all the complexity there is, I believe, a simple structure. Those who want to use the university, especially the humanities, for leftist political transformation correctly perceive that the Western rationalistic tradition is an obstacle in their path. In spite of their variety, most of the challengers to the traditional conception of education correctly perceive that if they are forced to conduct academic life according to a set of rules determined by constraints of truth, objectivity, clarity, rationality, logic, and the brute existence of the real world, their task is made all the more difficult, perhaps impossible. For example, if you think that the purpose of teaching the history of the past is to achieve social and political transformation of the present, then the traditional canons of historical scholarship, the canons of objectivity, evidence, close attention to the facts, and above all, truth, can sometimes seem an unnecessary and oppressive regime that stands in the way of achieving more important social objectives. In my experience, at least, the present multiculturalist reformers of higher education did not come to a revised conception of education from a refutation of the Western rationalistic tradition. Rather, they sought a refutation of the Western rationalistic tradition that would justify a revised conception of education that they already found appealing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's going on.
Right. The education system now is taking apart the individual as well, right? So it's gone from setting up the imbalance between people, because there's always somebody who's doing better than somebody else. There's that always. But now it's not just that. Now it's also biologically deciding that that you can make decisions about what's better and what's worse in your biology and change that.
Yes, they would say they have gone, because they want to keep digging deeper and deeper, because every time they try to, the cycle has been, they dig down and think that they can undermine Western rationalistic tradition. They want to undermine our that doesn't work. Well, capitalism just didn't work. So now we have to go from capitalism into the culture. Then we have to go from culture right into the concepts. And now they've dug down and said, well, now we actually, to get our politics, we actually have to dig down to the self, to the fundamental axioms of human nature, to the transcendental principles of human nature, to the point where they now believe that there is no fixed point of reference for anything. And they can then use that to try and undermine any justification for Western civilization continuing in anything like its current or traditional form. And then, with the crypto-normative piece, they smuggle in the leftist values using rhetorical devices and normative rhetoric.
Yeah.
And so that's the connection between postmodernism and Marxism. The contradiction exists only at the level of the superficial. If you take both of them to their logical conclusions, both of those, and you push them right to the end, you can see, hey, it looks like there's a contradiction here somehow. But if you look at what the goals and strategies are and the underlying principles in play, they can be fused quite easily. Once you dig through Marx and you realize, you know what? The communist parties like Lenin and Stalin, that's one thing, but the underlying Marxist philosophy of, say, somebody like Gramsci is anti-essentialist. It denies transcendent values. It denies transcendent principles. It thinks that all human beings are an ensemble of social relations. It denies any fixed human nature. Wait, postmodernism does all that too. And you might say, well, postmodernism denies any meta-narratives, but when you drill down, you find out, well, postmodernism is a meta-narrative, and they've been playing hide the ball with the crypto normativity. They've been hiding their moral values and smuggling them in. And once you realize that, the underlying set of principles and political goals and the way of thinking about the world is easily fused. And that's what's happened in social justice. They have fused those two elements, and then they've brought in things from critical race theory. They've brought in things from post-colonial theory, but that underlying structure,
whatever they need. Yeah,
whatever they need to make their political agenda work. So Foucault was never Foucault's theory, if you follow it to its logical conclusion. I mean, Foucault was even asked a question once. Someone said, given that you don't believe in anything like a totality, why should we believe anything you say? What reason is there for us to believe you? And Foucault laughed and said, there is none. Let me see if I can find that quote real quick, because he just comes right out and says it. It's kind of stunning. He just comes, it's the last question, as he was, Foucault was responding to questions from an audience at the Berkeley History Department in 1983. And someone said to him, given the fact that you don't try and refute theories, you claim not to be a structuralist, nor do you believe in a totality, why should we believe you? Right? So he says, you don't try to refute theories. So there's not a true and false dimension to your work. You're just trying to be purely descriptive. You claim not to be a structuralist, nor do you believe in a totality. Why should we what reason do we have to believe you? And Foucault's response is, there is no reason. And he laughs. That's his response. So he has to smuggle in the normative values using loaded language. And that's the connection between postmodernism and Marxism. And Searle nailed it with his response on the Western rationalistic tradition in 1994 when he said, you guys aren't coming to your multiculturalist theories, your intersectional theories, all of this stuff, because you've refuted our Western civilization's ideas of objectivity and truth. No. You're looking for theories to get rid of the objectivity and truth so that you can implement your politics. And that's exactly what Kelly Oliver says. We need strategic theories, not true theories, not false theories, strategic theories.
Yeah. Politics. No transcendence, just politics.
Yep. That's it.
So now we have politics in the schools.
Yep.
We have politics. I think we probably have politics in Medicare, in our healthcare systems.
I mean, you could see that with the vaccine. I got double vaxxed and I was fine. I never had any problem getting vaccinated. But I was watching the vaccine mandates and said, we're going to make the vaccine mandatory. Okay. But we also want to have marginalized groups and people of color at the front of the line. And I sat there and I thought, wait, you're going to make the vaccine, the virus is so deadly, you want to mandate the vaccine for everybody, but you're going to create a line based on social justice. You're not going to vaccinate the people who need it most first. You're not going to vaccinate the vulnerable. You're not going to vaccinate the people who want it most. You're going to force everyone to get it, but you're going to put them in order of social justice hierarchies. That doesn't sound like how we do health. That sounds like politics.
Sounds like politics. Yeah.
Because they do politics and everything. Everything is a vehicle for politics. Everything.
Yeah.
All of it. And they said it for years. And I keep, it's like just It's a lot of me reading stuff because I'm just keep quoting them and quoting because they keep telling us they're doing this. And then when Jordan says the postmodern neo-Marxist, everyone stands up and goes, well, what are you talking about? What? That's not even possible. How could that happen? Right? Well, how would Jordan pick up on that? Well, if you're a psychologist and you're really, really good at understanding how motivations function and how goals function, and you start looking at people in terms of what their goals and behavior are to determine what the underlying worldview is, once you read Foucault, it's really easy to spot the crypto-normativity. You don't need to read her.
Define crypto-normativity. Define
crypto-normativity. Normativity is the normative standards for morality.
Yeah.
Crypto-normativity comes from the word cryptic. And what we're doing with crypto-normativity is we're smuggling in the value judgments while pretending we're not. Okay, we're going to use loaded language. We're going to hide it. We're going to be cryptic about our moral values. We're going to use the kind of language which shows you where we think, while officially denying that we haven't taken a moral position. So we're going to say, well, the Trump regime has done this. And then we're going to talk about the Biden administration. I haven't stated what where my morals are, but you know darn well from the language exactly where I stand, even though I haven't officially said it, right? That's crypto-normativity, and that's what they do. That's Heath's point. Heath is actually a brilliant philosopher. He was one of the writers of the book The Rebel Cell, which is an absolutely phenomenal book. He also wrote
The Rebel Cell, C-E-L-L?
The Rebel Cell, R-E-B-L, Rebel?
Yeah.
Cell, S-E-L-L. And it was
The Rebel Cell. Okay.
Yeah. And that was a book written in, I believe it was 2000, 2001, and it was talking about the counterculture of the time and their views and how they were going after capitalism and the idea that we needed to subvert society and plug people from the matrix and all of this. That sort of 60s kind of hippie counterculturalism. He wrote a book about that. And that counterculturalism, a lot of the energy of that counterculturalism, that movement, patched over to social justice. Those lefties from those hippie days, the kind of like, the man's out to brainwash you, man. The police are sending the fuzz round to bust your stash, man. Like, kind of those hippies. Kind of the ideology moves along and leaves that behind. And so the Rebel Cell described the situation perfectly in 2000. This book, Cynical Theories, captures the situation 20 years later, here in 2023. Heath is brilliant, and he's the one who pulled the thing about crypto-normativity out. And as soon as I went back and read Habermas's, where he hits Foucault and says, look, man, you say, you're giving us a guide to resistance, but why resist? Well, because you have a moral
he was
values.
a professor of philosophy from U of T.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I believe
when
he's at U of T.
Is he still there?
Oh, I don't know. Let's find out. Heath is a well-known and well-respected political philosopher. I wonder where he's at now. Let's see. He went to Northwestern and at McGill.
Oh, I see.
And he's affiliated still with the University of Toronto. Yeah. Yeah, he's in he still have his page up he's in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. He's still there. He's fantastic.
What's his first name? What's his first name?
Joseph Heath.
Joseph Heath. Yeah. Okay. I'll have to look him up.
Now, I don't know that Joseph Heath is going to agree with any of my politics, and he may have to disavow me to keep his job. but his work is fantastic. He's got a book called Cooperation and Social Justice, which is just an excellent bit of philosophy, dealing with problems of everything from stigmatization to immigration. He's really got important things to say. And I think his work is really great. If he needs to disavow me to keep his career, that's fine. I understand. But his work is fantastic. It really is. And I mean, I am not a hard righty in the sense of...
No, you don't even look like a hard righty.
I wouldn't even be, I would be a moderate Republican, or maybe even perhaps a kind of a centrist in the United States. In Canada, I mean, I worked with the Saskatchewan Party. So that kind of prairie populist movement is kind of where my politics are. And so a guy like Heath is just like singing my song on a whole ton of stuff now. I don't know that he'd be a populist, but his book, I think he also wrote a book called The Efficient Society, which is a defense of the Canadian way of doing things.
The Efficient Society, yeah.
Yeah, but that's from years ago. And that the Efficient Society back then would have been like from the 80s, 90s, and maybe early 2000s, like that kind of thing. What Trudeau is doing now, I don't know that that's the Efficient Society.
It doesn't seem like it.
No, but yeah, Heath is really, really great. I pull a lot of my thinking from him, although I don't know that he would agree with the way I've used everything he said. I think that I think he's absolutely nailed it in terms of understanding the crypto-normativism, and I think that his work on cooperation is excellent. So
definitely look him up.
Heath is great.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting again. I'm always learning stuff here, and I need to learn things because we got to know what's going on.
That's right. We're all learning. I learned so much preparing for this because I was like, I've got to really pin this down with sources. So I went hunting, and I was like, as I was finding this stuff, I was like, they've been saying this the whole time, and nobody knew. Like it's all right there. Okay, well, I'm just gonna pull that out and tell everybody. So they say there are no postmodern neo-Marxists. This also. When I saw you guys in Calgary, Jordan said, "Well, the connection between Marxism and postmodernism is not clear." And he says, "Explain it to Tammy, and then you and I will talk." And I was like, "Okay, I'll go figure it out." So I went and I hunted around and I figured it out.
Good for you. Good for you.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to chat again.
Very nice chatting with you. Are we finished now, do you think? Do we have more to chat about, or are we done?
I think that's enough for the average person. I think the average person.
I think so too.
We could do the Cyril paper maybe next time talking about language. And that's Jonathan Pageau's The Fringe and the Center.
Okay, that'd be good.
And Pageau, I love Pageau. I think
I do too.
I might be too verbose for his liking. But he's captured conceptually the thing that the postmodernists have hijacked in order to get a lot of what they're doing, and that's that fringe center distinction.
Yeah.
And he's got a hold on that. And Cyril picked up on how that game was being played back in, I think, when did he do that? When was that paper written? 95? 96? And he pinned that down. And so I want to provide the philosophical resources to undergird Pageau's insights. And maybe he'll appreciate that. I don't know.
I'm sure he would. I will.
Okay.
I will.
We'll talk about that.